to get started, one thing I want to mention before we jump right into it is I was just listening to something from Morningstar this morning that might be interesting for some of you, especially if you've got Medicare coverage. There's some changes that are coming to Medicare in this next year, specifically with Part D. So this podcast here, Morningstar Investing Insights, has a bunch of nice things. This one's only 16 minutes long, but they've got a bunch of other episodes and podcasts that are really great. Another one that I've added is Money Stuff, the podcast from Bloomberg as well. And then anything from Charles Schwab, Morningstar, and Bloomberg are all great. So those are all places I'm getting a little bit of information from. So that'll be interesting. One of the things that was talked about in here that's actually summarized right here is there's a new cap for out-of-pocket expenses with Part D at $2,000. So as soon as you hit that out-of-pocket maximum, there's no more coverage. So that's particularly for people who have very complicated and expensive coverage care costs for Medicare Part D. So something to take a look at. And also just gives you a little bit of tips and things that you should do annually if you've got that Part D or Medicare Advantage, things that you should be checking up on as it comes around, as the open enrollment rolls around every year. What a time for the markets recently, by the way. I'm sure you've heard this headline a million times by now, but the S&P had quite literally its most explosive reaction to an election ever in U.S. history. That was the largest rise we have ever seen. It was like everything was up an incredible amount. I think Dow Jones ended at 3.5 up or close to. S&P was around 2.5 or 3, and then or something like that. And NASDAQ was up. All of them were just flying, and it was ridiculous. I have not seen Tesla. What has Tesla done lately? Yeah, I also saw that Apple went up significantly as well. And because of that, I forget which semiconductor company it was. But there's one particular, I don't remember if it was Qualcomm. I think it's Qualcomm, but they get like 27% of their revenue from Apple and then another 20-something% from Samsung. So those companies have all been doing ridiculous. Yeah, let's see. I'm going to pull up Tesla here and see what we got. Yeah, it's up 8% today. So, yeah, it fell back down from this high a little bit, but yeah, it's been kind of ridiculous over the last 5 days. It's up 29% over the last 5 days. That's ridiculous.
Don't get any better.
I know you're asking because you've got a position that's not doing so hot.
Do I want to buy a stock? Buy the bond. Okay, I'll help out. It was down a lot, but it dropped down.
Nope, it's still down today. It's not. Intel's not doing too hot. That was one of those companies because the best stock trade I've ever made was buying AMD when it was really cheap at like $10 a share. That was really great. But that's not because I could pick a stock. That's because I understood that industry. Because I've built computers and done that kind of stuff all of my life. So I saw like what they were trying to do and what kind of market share there was available. It was just an opportunity that you could, if you understood what you were looking at, you could see from a mile away. And those don't present themselves very often. But that was just at a point where Intel was the person who had the monopoly in the space that they were entering. And they had been not really competing, offering a competing product, but not actually competing for decades. It had been like 20 years since they were at all on par with Intel. And then they finally released this new thing. And I just saw them dumping money into research and development for years. And then finally they released this thing and they took a bunch of market share. And then they tried to compete with NVIDIA too, and they have a little bit of headway there, but there's still some room to go. And then Intel tried to do a similar thing, and they tried to compete with NVIDIA, and we were all pretty excited about it, and it just completely flopped. It was a horrible product, just really, really bad, and they just never really saved it. So they've just been doing horribly, because people were trying to ride that hype before they were going to release it. So we were all pretty excited to be like, oh my God, we'll have 3 different options for this type of product. And then they just completely dropped the ball because it was horrible. It was really bad.
So, previous class, it was suggested that elections really don't have an impact on the market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If we're talking about long-term planning and long-term investing, they don't really like change the course of returns, but they like,
It's just a, it's gonna level up or go back down.
there will definitely be something that causes us to, whether it's like something that is equally the other direction, I don't know. But like kind of my point is when you take this reaction or even take what this year or 4 years, the whole term, and you put that into the long-term perspective, it's just going to be another thing that contributes to the same average number. You know what I mean? So it's like there are some elections or some policies that are going to drive us really strongly down and we're going to have a poor stock market. There's some that are going to be amazing, but that's kind of been my point this whole time, is that those massive swings are what you want to stay invested through so that you get the end result. It's like, I'm not trying to position myself to feel this as much as possible. I'm just understanding I'm invested and I'm not changing my plan. I'm following through because I want to make sure to feel this. And it just, I keep repeating this quote, and I was actually telling this to, he did a little presentation last night for some of the students here. And I was talking to one of them afterwards, and he likes to more actively trade and do things because, you know, he's young and he's trying to like outsize returns and all that kind of stuff. And one thing that he didn't hear that I've said a couple times here is if you miss the 10 best days of the last 30 years, your returns will be cut in half. Let that sink in one more time. The 10 best days of the last 30 years. And those best days are not usually these days. They're the ones that come right after the crash. And that's usually why people miss out on them, because they'll see this giant fall in prices of securities and they'll be like, I need to get out of this volatility. When that's the volatility you want, that's what you want to be buying into. That's what you want to at least hold through, if not add more for. That's what's going to give you the outsized returns for the most part. Like you're disciplined to actually stay on track and contribute more and go more risk on when prices go down. That's your opportunity to generate any kind of alpha, really. Yeah, that's a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know what you mean. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I felt that before. I mean, I go back to when I think it was, I don't remember if it was before the election with Biden or what was happening. It was sometime around that time when cannabis was all the rage. Like everybody was talking about cannabis funds, and like I had quite a few in my IRA and they were doing really well. It was like 30, 40% returns. Like this is amazing. And if we get federal legalization, it's just gonna, and then the conversation just like stopped. Like there wasn't a definitive, it's not happening, or they just stopped talking about it. It just stopped being an issue of conversation. And all of those funds, the last time that I looked before I sold them and transferred it out to something else, we're down 80%, 80 to 85%. And so that kind of hurts.
What happened is legalization of it caused more supply. Prices come down. When you start legalizing the production of all these small farmers, and I was saying, look, if you want to make it legal, make it local farmers, small family producers. But that's like exploding the wine business, and all the little producers get more out of it.
Yeah.
But I said, you could give them to Walmart, right? Because when you increase the supply, the price goes down. I got out of my positions. But you're never going to know. The reason the stock market went up a lot, obviously, was short-term political, but there's trillions of dollars waiting to come back in. And they believe that this new president's plan, whether it works or not, we don't know. And you want to work in your plan or the opposite. So if I was going to do anything short-term, it would be the opposite. And I did make buys that morning. We had a client who said, when the election occurs, we'll make, try to survive. But we added to funds that were not developed after the market went up. So consumer staples went down 2%. When the market went up 2.5%, so that was a good buying opportunity. Preferred stocks and energy at that point. Don't follow the big one that's going up quite a bit. You should either already hold it or wait for a second chance investment. I think that's the message I'm hearing now from you guys. Yeah. The common person, I consider myself common, or like the ignorant, is desperate to jump in because the future's so great. Whereas you guys have already seen
the history of these types of transactions.
Yeah, this is all human behavior. Everything is, right? Short term, that there is no real value of the human behavior and attraction. Long term is how does it produce dividends of the do. So buying something that has good long-term potential isn't up 300%. It's too late. There's a lot of other great buys. We just don't know who they are. So then you buy a fund that does something in that direction. And says, hey, this is a good fund and I like the way they're structured. And they're looking for new and big stuff, not they're looking for new things like this. And so he has funds that don't think that are ETFs, that's their rules-based investing. They look for companies like that. But the validation is I'm going to buy Tesla now because it's up and feels good. But then you might fall off.
Yeah, and that's again why every time that we talk about investment choices or we talk about any of these things, I always stress utility. Like, what is it doing for you? It's not how are you going to participate in this trend? How are you going to like make all of this? If you're looking for growth, there are some great growth funds out there and you can put that there. But if that's not what you need, if what you need is consistent yield, that's what you should be looking for. If what you need is lower volatility, that's what you should be looking for. That's why I bias so strongly that core positions, like 50 to 70% of that portfolio, should be based on statistics, long-term statistics that make sense, that hold up over time. It's like, well, I don't care if there's a growth fund that's outperformed everybody over the last year, because if you just pick the Magnificent Seven, that fund has done better than S&P for a while, but there are some times that it doesn't. And that extra risk could increase, like could just decrease your ability to do well. And like, especially if it's like just a lot of these active funds or even passive funds that are just really concentrated. Like if you get too much into that, you just increase your overall risk profile because you're adding other types of risk. So even if it goes, well, the standard deviation is not that bad, well, maybe it's only existed in favorable markets for that sector. You don't know. You have to look at the long-term time frames. You have to consider all of the political differences that can happen, regulations, government, everything. Everything matters. And that's why our core positions are so well diversified and so based on just statistical data, because that's what's going to hold true long term. I might be able to make a really good decision for you on 1% of the portfolio. But if I do that on 100% and it just so happens that I wasn't right that time, that's going to really screw everything out. So anyway, let's talk over some of the stuff where we got started last time. We're just now diving into, we're finally leaving all the advanced, complicated investment stuff behind, and we're talking about all the things that you want to keep up on after you've created your plan and after you've really like put all your strategies down and got all these tools together. Now that you have actually done this work, what are you doing to keep it working? So that's portfolio monitoring, which is still to do with the investments and really just redoing your evaluation over and over again to make sure it's in line. For the most part, risk, sure, fees are important, sure, taxes are important, but the most important thing is to make sure you're not just completely at risk of loss, because that's going to be the biggest detractor to everything. Estate planning maintenance is really just checking up on minute things and making sure everything is going the right direction. And then tax efficiency management is probably, in my opinion, unless you have giant red flags that are just completely obvious, one of the least important things, because there's just not a lot that you're going to do to really reduce tax liability. There are some things that you can do to make it easier, but if you just look at long-term math on things for tax efficiency, usually what you can do is either delay it or you can get rid of taxes by only doing one thing. And I think a lot of you know what the answer is, and that's by dying. That's like the only way you're going to get away from taxes, is by leaving them to beneficiaries and letting the basis step up. But for the most part, the only thing that you're going to do is delay taking the taxes. So it's kind of like looking at what period of time is it best for me to take on this liability. So for example, I'm just thinking of an example that I was thinking about recently, is if you're getting close to like the Medicare look-back period, and you know that there are assets upon which you do have considerable taxable gains, it might be worth it to take those gains early, so that that does not become a consideration later and affect Medicare premiums, and then that cost jumps up, and now like that's just extra planning that we can front load and get rid of. It's still going to hurt. You're still going to pay a ton of money in taxes, but it will only be the tax difference and not taxes plus premiums. You know what I mean? So it's just kind of like, how do I make sure I'm not, getting hurt by two things at the same time? You're always going to have to pay the taxes unless you leave it to a beneficiary. But how can we make sure that we're not getting hurt by it twice?
Speaking of taxes, somebody was telling me yesterday that, if I die and my kids get the Roth, they can continue with the Roth and all the interest paid to Roth, or made by the Roth, is still for them tax.
Still tax-free. They just have to take it out over 10 years. That's the only thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But but they can continue, can they add to it?
No, they can't add to a beneficiary Roth IRA. They can, but they take it out over 10 years, all tax-free. So you're all good there.
We're getting to the end of the year, tax loss harvesting and all that kind of stuff, but capital gains, how long do you have to hold something before you can avoid the ordinary income? Number one, a lot of people trade buy, sell, and they don't realize they're gonna pay out a higher tax for that.
Yeah.
Versus holding the stock or the fund itself, right?
Mhm.
And then at what point does somebody, probably not everybody here, but maybe their kids, if they're in a low enough income, you could transfer stocks to the child, let them sell it, and they're on a low tax or no capital tax.
Right. I don't remember what the brackets are, but I think it's 80-something thousand for the 0%. And then it's a pretty big stretch in the middle for 15. I think 20 is, I think it was like 500, 400 something. I don't remember what the exact brackets are, but I think it's somewhere, I'm just guessing 82 was the 0%. I can pull up those numbers in a second, but for long-term capital gains, you want to make sure that you're holding that asset for a year and a day. Don't forget the day, because if you just hold it for 365 days and sell it on the 365th days, that's going to be ordinary income. So it's a year and a day. Don't forget the last day.
We've had the ability to incorporate stocks, bonds, trade them, buy this, buy that. But if we did it too actively, it would trigger ordinary income taxes, not capital gains if you're buying and selling.
Right, if there are gains, but if you're offsetting with losses, then.
But also you have the cost of the trade, meaning the difference between the markup and all that, right? Buying and selling stock. Yeah, there's a spread.
Yes, but if you're buying a liquid asset, that's pretty much negligible.
If it's a highly liquid asset, everybody's trading.
Yeah.
Want to be careful to buy and sell. That's going to trigger short-term capital gain. And if it's an asset that there's not a huge volume in, you might end up getting the lower of the price. You wanted X, but you got Y because there wasn't many buyers out there. So we don't like to buy, sell, because it hurts the client's taxes and it might increase the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
Stocks being children
Yes.
without including consequences.
To use.
Yeah.
To them, if they're in that lower income bracket, they can sell the stock and not pay the capital.
Yeah, and the only thing to pay attention to, which really isn't much of a concern for most of us, but is if it's within the annual exclusion, you don't have to worry about it. So that's right now 18,000. Next year will be 19. If you transfer that value, there's no consequence at all to you, like nothing. Totally fine. If you go over that for the year, then you eat into your lifetime exemption, which is the big estate tax exemption number, which is the 13.92 million,
Yeah.
92 or 94, going up to 13.99 next year. So if you go over that 18,000 for the year, it eats into that. But obviously, if you don't have an estate that's like $15-20 million, that's not really a concern for you. So
But then the two Senate, whoever makes.
yeah.
Except the bottom one down first.
Yep.
You're not going to pay any taxes.
Yeah. You can choose to pay gift taxes if you want to preserve that estate exemption. So if you think there's a chance that you could have too much, or if you're concerned about the sunsetting and you just want to make sure that you keep as much of it as possible. So if you've got like 6 or 7 or 8 million, somewhere in that range, and you want to make sure that you don't eat up any of your exemption, you could decide to pay the gift taxes. What that will also do is the gift tax that you pay will proportionally, by a little amount, increase the basis of the asset that you're gifting, which means that if they do have to pay capital gains, it'll reduce that by a very slight amount, just a little portion of the gift tax paid. I don't remember exactly how to do the calculation, but
It's a perfect example of just the election, whether you like them or don't like them. We're assuming, and all of us are saying, it's got, you can win the lottery, give away 13 million, there's no state taxes. Oh, no, that's going down to 5 with inflation, so not 5, 6 or 7. And so if you have an estate slightly or a lot over that, you've got some massive taxes. Right? And then I would tell insurance agents, look, if you want to go sell life insurance, you can sell it on the fact that this estate might owe a lot of taxes. Just don't keep it in the estate. But now the new administration, good or bad, says that they're gonna extend that and make it permanent. So now all of a sudden, it's not a problem. You can give away 13 million and then that's indexed for inflation. That's how fast things can change. Who would have thought? And humans, and the good thing is that you can make different decisions. And the good thing is we don't know where the market's going, because if we did, there would be no market. Right? So it's always gonna be human behaviors and who thinks what. We're always gonna be problem.
yeah.
You guys know like that service for filling out the form and all that, 'cause that, who else?
Oh, for the estate tax,
Yeah.
we could look it up and download it, help somebody do that, if you give away more than 18, or, usually your tax person. Tax person,
Yeah.
No, but you could, I'm sure you go to the IRS website, download it and say, I gave so-and-so a gift. Because if you don't do it, it's not the end of the world, but you're supposed to tell the government you gave more than the 18,000, just in case you win the lottery tomorrow, then they want it. Sure.
So we talked a little bit more just about portfolio monitoring, just making sure that we're continuing to serve our goals, objectives, cash needs, risk tolerance, all the normal stuff, but we're just still doing that. We talked about all the different stuff that you should theoretically be doing continuously. If you miss a day, it's all right. Just get caught up, make sure that you're aware of everything that's going on. Like just, for example, the election. Don't feed into the emotional side of the election, but actually go look at policies, actually go look at what's being proposed, and also understand that proposals don't always lead to a real policy. So keep it in the back of your mind and stay updated on it, but don't start making plans based on promises also. That's always never a good idea, because we all know that politicians love to say all this wonderful, beautiful stuff, and then you just get to the end of your term and you think, where did all of that go? Like, regardless of how you feel about what somebody promises, it's so interesting to see like everything that they promised during their campaign. Then you get to the end of their term and you think, even though I didn't like what you were going to do, you didn't do that at all. Like, where's your follow through, man? So it's just interesting. Pay attention to stuff in the tax code, stuff like that. So obviously like those exemptions, those annual gift exclusions, stuff like that, always important. Around this time of year is a great time to start picking up on the new data. That's what we're doing in office. Like admin staff is constantly handing me sheets of paper. Like here's the new numbers, here's the new stuff to pay attention to so I can use that with a client. Just keep an eye on the activities of the Fed. You notice they dropped by 25 basis points again recently. So that was interesting. Measuring your portfolio and just keeping up on everything that's happening inside of it. Not necessarily making changes all the time. I don't want to see weekly trades, but if it's a time to be rebalancing, then you can be looking, but just being aware of what's happening in your portfolio. Awareness is like the first thing. And that's just something that I really want to make sure is very clear, is like, you don't always have to be tweaking everything and making all these changes and doing stuff every single day of the year, but just being aware is really important. Because if you're constantly aware, then you know when something important comes up and you can get right to it. It's just really important to just be up on it. And continuing your education is really important. We'll give you plenty of good value, plenty of good data, but there's so much out there. And there's a lot of stuff that could specifically apply to your situation that I may never cover, but you might just hear it. You might read it on an article, you might hear it on a podcast. And also, don't take everything directly from these sources, these educations, like even stuff that I say. Back it up with IRS code, back it up with laws. Like, make sure that you're validating what you're hearing, no matter who you're hearing it from. Make sure that everything you're doing is actually following all of the laws and all of the tax codes so that you know that you're properly doing things. Just make sure you're looking for new funds if you want to. If you want to If you really, really like always having the best possible fund in your portfolio like I do, just be looking around. Again, you don't always have to be making changes, but you can always say, ah, that looks really interesting. I'm just going to put this over in my notes over here and keep that earmarked for the next time I want to make a trade. Because an opportunity might present itself and you think, oh, well, I wanted to move over here anyway, and then you can do so. Make sure you're bringing your portfolio cost down when you can. The difference between 20 and 60 basis points is not going to kill you long term. But if you've got funds, like think about old A-share mutual funds you might have, where you paid 6% up front and you're paying like 1.2% management fee. That's probably something we want to shift out of. So just looking to see if there's stuff that just is absolutely ridiculous and totally off the deep end, try and bring those costs down. Oftentimes you can find funds that are really similar in holdings for much cheaper. That's what I like to do a lot of the time, especially if I'm looking for a trade. Loss positions are great for replacing for lower cost. If you've got something that's down 10 or 20%, don't be too sad. Look at it as an opportunity. Maybe it's time to switch something so that you can adjust your risk tolerance. Maybe it's time to find a cheaper fund that does the same thing. Or maybe you're just looking for a different sector to get involved in. There's just losses are opportunities. So take advantage of them when you can. See if old mutual funds have been transitioned into ETFs and if they're still suitable. Now, we found that the whole idea of converting mutual funds into ETFs kind of got stopped in its tracks. It just didn't really make any progress. So that doesn't really seem like it's something that's going to be available. So you'll still have to sell and buy. But it's possible that there could be some new products that are cheaper that are pretty much the same thing that you can replace. Quarterly is really when you want to make sure that you're deep diving into all this stuff that we talked about with your portfolio, so that if you need to make an adjustment, if you need to make a reallocation, this is probably when you'd want to do it. And this is about as frequent as I would want to see rebalance trades happen. If we're talking about reallocations and you need to change things, just go ahead and get right on it so the risk profile fits what you need. But if we're just looking for slightly increasing yields, slightly reducing expenses, slightly better returns, go on more of a quarterly to biannual basis, in my opinion. You don't want to cut off runners or accept losses too quickly. Yes?
Balancing, is there some measure of the whole market's volatility? So like right now, might be my time to rebalance this my quarter. But you know, what you said 5 days ago, should I somehow put that off, or is there some measure that's out there to say this is we're too low?
So I'll respond to that in 2 points. One of the most common ways to kind of see what is the volatility currently is something called the VIX index, VIX. That's just sort of a measurement of generally the sentiment of volatility in the market. When it swings up, that's when things are feeling really dramatic and there's a lot happening. But at the same time, the main thing I would focus on is if you're acceptably within a good risk level for what you're looking for, I wouldn't touch too much just to allow, I don't like to do too many changes when there's ridiculous volatility because I don't know what I'm getting in and out of. And I don't want to, again, like that sort of idea of missing those 10 best days, I don't want to necessarily cut myself short. So if you need to make a change to get within acceptable risk levels, like if you are going to need to take income and the volatility is pretty high for that, make the change because that's most important. But if you're within a relatively acceptable level for where you should be, I wouldn't be making too many changes so that if we do have a really good rally, you can participate in that and you can get a little bit of the benefit. Biannually, just make sure you're monitoring for those really big runs, those really big, especially those like smaller sector funds. Leave your index funds alone, let them do what they're going to do. But if utilities just happen to shoot up by 60% in the last couple months, maybe it's time to pull that out and roll into something else that hasn't been doing super well. So make sure you, same thing. It's like I said, it's most relevant for those specialty sector funds. Like this is just those more concentrated positions. That's what we're mostly worried about. And we're not doing this for total market funds, like I said. So anything like those growth index funds, mid cap, small cap, those sorts of things. If you're more split off into like value and growth, and maybe there are some things that you can do, but for the most part, when I'm doing these like rotations, I'm thinking more about sectors. I'm thinking more about stuff that's more cyclical, things that are more sensitive to regulations or particular bits of the economy, stuff like that. Things that are more sensitive to more concentrated investments that are more sensitive to more concentrated risks. You know, it's like those unsystematic things that we talked about before, where you've got more regulatory, financial, company, like any of those things that are just, they're not just overall market volatility. That's where I would be doing these sort of rotations based on performance.
Kind of going against the crowd, because right, you have a stock or a fund that's just wildly low. It doesn't mean it won't keep going, but it's always nice to take a little bit off. Consumer staples or grocery store stocks are down because they're boring, and if the economy gets better, maybe people won't have a shortage. So we kind of go the opposite. If you want to, but you also have to ask yourself, if I move money out of the market from this position to that one, is it going to make me more upset if it goes up, or if I didn't get out, if it went down? So it's a comfort level. It just feels like things are getting a little over aggressive here, and I'm going to move some money out of the market into something more stable. And if I'm wrong, good for you. You made money, and I just needed to back up and get out of the race and sit in the stands a little bit. Try not to be right. Do what's right for you, but try not to guess what's right, because then that's when you run into trouble. Because this market can keep going, and everything turned out great. This is the big renaissance. We don't know. So you just do what's right for you and your neighbor. If they're a gambler, good for you.
Yeah. And then again, annually, like, just make sure you review yourself, review your plan, make sure that you're still going in the direction you want to, and don't be upset or resistant to change if you just understand that what you did previously is not where you want to be now. If you've got a different idea of what makes you comfortable and what makes you feel good about your investments or anything else, or just your life in general, accept that change. That's totally fine. And you need to go into that. You need to get into that ideal and really just make sure that everything follows where you want to be at. Because you might have been much more invested for income, or you might have been more invested for growth, and you might just have changed feelings, and that's fine. Like, even if the math would be better if you stayed over on this side, if you can still succeed and feel more emotionally stable, I say that's a fine place to be. Like, you can just, when you move to that place, especially while you're accumulating, it's very easy to be risk on, you know, because you're adding to it and you can grow and grow. And even if things fall, it's easy to be, okay, I can get in and I can buy more things. But when you get to a distribution phase, it's very common to sort of to get more conservative than even your plan might need to dictate. And that's okay. If your assets, if you can create a plan that still fulfills your goals and be more conservative than you really need to be, why not? Why not feel better? So that's something I always kind of advocate for, is making sure that you feel really good about your plan. Not just that you understand the math is going to work out, but that you know that you're going to be able to stick to it, because that's the other thing. The math could be perfect, but if you are not stable enough to stick to that plan, it doesn't matter. Like, it's not, you could change the course of your plan even if your plan is perfect. You could ruin it by selling at the wrong time, by taking some sort of outsized distribution for something, or just any of these emotional things, or anything that you might not have planned for. So just make sure that you know that you can stay the course no matter what happens. And that's what's going to make most of the difference. The investment returns will help. The estate planning, the insurance coverage, all of that is super important. But making sure that you can stay the path is the #1 determinant of whether you're going to succeed or not.
You took me out of the interview 2 years ago or a year or so ago. It kept going up after it, a big amount. I'm like, oh man, I missed that. And it kept, but then after that, it started to wane, and it moved into growth stocks, and they weren't doing that great. And then all of a sudden, they're beautiful. So long term, it was a great move. Short term, it was, oh, I'm going to stay with this. But then it allocated, it was just too much money in that sector. And so I said, okay, let's go out. But it took several months before it turned out to be a good move. Not that he knew what was going to happen, but it was just overbalanced. You have too much money in this one sector, and it's not wise.
Yep. Okay. So now let's get started with today. I've already used up so much time. We'll try and fly through some of this. But we're going to talk about some estate planning maintenance. And we're just going to fly through a bunch of these account types because I'm sure you're familiar with some of them. But please stop me and ask questions if there's any clarification that you need. So obviously, it's the same stuff as a lot of the portfolio maintenance with the estate planning maintenance. It's just making sure that everything's still doing what you want it to do. Make sure that the right people are still getting the right assets, that nothing is particularly vulnerable to any sort of risk. And if you have any needs, make sure they're provided for, and same stuff. So let's talk about the basic account types that you'll see. You've got your retail/individual account, just anything that's just in your name, the basic thing. You've got a brokerage account that's just yours, it's going to be this one. You got a checking account, that's what this is. You've got your individual transfer on death, which is basically the same thing, but you just tack on this provision called transfer on death or transfer upon death. There's one other way that it's phrased that I can't remember right now. Yeah, POD is, yeah, payable on death. That's the other one. So you might see POD or TOD. That's basically just saying that upon your death, it will immediately transfer to the control of whoever you have listed on. And that's a good way to really, really easily have your basic accounts avoid probate. And the reason that we want to avoid probate is because it's expensive, it's timely, it takes a lot of time. It can take like 2 years in California sometimes, and they charge a percentage of your assets. So if you've got a lot of assets, you really don't want to go through probate. But a transfer upon death can just skirt right under that and go straight to your beneficiary. But just know that they have full rights as soon as you die, and they have full control. So if it's too much for them to handle, consider something like a trust. Joint with rights of survivorship, that's usually like the most common pick when people are creating a joint account. And that's basically just saying that it's shared by 2 individuals who can be spouses, they can be non-spouses, doesn't really matter. And when one owner dies, the survivor will receive the decedent's share of the account. So it's kind of split. So it's like each of you own half of the account in a way. And so when one of you will hold on to one bit, and the part that's important about this, which will distinguish between some other account types, is when the other owner dies, only their half gets a step up in basis. So not the entire value of the account steps up. If I've got, let's say we put in 50,000 into this joint brokerage account and it went up to 100, only 1/2 of that is going to get stepped up. The other half is you're still going to have to pay taxes on the sale of those assets when you withdraw. But when you go to a community property account, which we'll discuss a little bit more in a second, the entire value gets stepped up. We'll talk about why that's important once we get there. Joint tenants in common is similar to a right of survivorship, except it has no rights of survivorship. The half does not go to the other owner of the account. It goes to the estate of the person who died. So that's just like a really basic difference. If you've got rights of survivorship, it goes to the other owner. If you have tenants in common, it goes to their estate and not to the other owner.
But I've heard
Yes.
it in real estate, like having title property, but does it also pertain to like other accounts? Like,
Yes, absolutely. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, investment accounts and checking accounts and all sorts of stuff. Joint tenants with rights of survivorship is going to be your most common. You'll see that most of the time, but a lot of people will not think of that tax consequence when it comes down to it. Joint tenancy by the entirety, and this is one that we don't see in California because we use community property. These are like kind of these are very similar registrations, but they differ depending on what state you're in. So if you're looking at a different state, you might see tenancy by the entirety, but here you're going to see community property. So tenancy by the entirety, it's reserved only for married couples, and it permits spouses to own property as a single legal entity. So you can kind of think the marriage owns this property rather than like each person. So each spouse has an equal and undivided interest, and that includes rights of survivorship so that it goes straight to the other person upon death. And creditors cannot enforce a lien on any property that falls under tenancy by the entirety if only one spouse owns the debt. So if you have a situation where you have this tenancy by the entirety account, and then one of the spouses has this big debt and that creditor needs to collect on that debt, they can't invade these assets to pay for that. So it's kind of a little bit of a protection, a way that you can protect some assets, obviously, if you're in a state that offers it. First derbies?
Yeah,
What-
what's that?
That's where it goes to the children equally, right?
Yeah,
Where it just kind of passes through.
yeah, so let's say you have joint tenancy and maybe they both die. I think it makes sure that the the second one to die, the kids get it. That sounds right.
I don't know. I don't really know if that's correct or not. So community property, similar. It's a joint asset that was either acquired during the marriage in certain states or re-registered to community property during marriage. Assets excluded from community property are separate assets brought into the marriage, owned by spouses prior to the marriage, or assets inherited by a spouse during the marriage. So that's kind of just, when you're in a community property state, a lot of stuff will automatically sort of get considered to be community property in some ways, and in some ways you determine that it is. But a lot of people will have joint tenants with rights of survivorship and will recommend that they re-register it to community property because of the tax consequence that I was talking about earlier. So if you've got that joint tenants with rights of survivorship, like I mentioned, only the person who dies half gets that step up in tax basis. However, with community property, if one spouse dies, because it's similar to tenancy by the entirety, in where sort of the way I like to think about it is the marriage owns the asset. When that one spouse dies, and therefore the marriage dies, the other spouse inherits the asset from the marriage and the entirety gets stepped up in tax basis. That's kind of how I like to think about that differently, is with these, instead of it being two people own the asset together, it's really their marriage that owns the asset. So when that marriage dies, one of the spouses will inherit the entirety of the property and all of it will get stepped up in basis. So that's a very common little thing that we tell married couples to do, is to re-register their JTWROS accounts into community property, just so that in the event of a death, there's no tax consequences.
Sometimes they don't want to do that if they don't want to family function. Financial planners said if you both die at the same time, we're gonna have a problem with joint tenancy. Spouse says, honey, we gotta go to this family function. No, we can't drive together and get something happens to it. We haven't done our trust yet, so I'm gonna have to stay home, but you enjoy.
Yeah. So the next couple things we've got are a trust account, which is just an account opened by the designated trustee of a funded trust, which allows for the deposit of funds to buy and sell investment products for the benefit of the trust. And obviously we're referencing brokerage accounts at this point. And houses and other property can also be registered into the name of a trust. So, I mean, we all know what a trust is. It's basically that entity account that separates itself from you. However, you can have revocable trusts and irrevocable trusts. Basically, it just means if the trust is revocable, you can take stuff in and out of it, and it's still considered a part of your estate when you pass. So again, that doesn't really matter too much for those of us that have regular sized estates. But if we are concerned that we're going to surpass the estate exemption, that $13 million, if we think that we're going to be passing on more than that, we might want to get things out of our estate. So if I've got, let's say I've got $10 million and $5 million and $5 million. So I got a $10 million property or something, and I got two $5 million brokerage accounts. I might want to take those $5 million brokerage accounts and put them into irrevocable trusts so that they leave my estate. Now the value of my estate drops under the exemption amount, and I don't have to pay that horrible 40% estate tax. That's kind of the main time that you're going to worry about that. Or if you just want to not have it represented that you have any control over that asset for other qualification reasons, stuff like that would be important. But a revocable trust, you could take things in and out of at any time.
Trust like you.
Sure, yeah, you can have as many trusts as you want. You can set it up as complicated as you need to, or as simply.
If you have a trust that's already set up, do you even need a pre-company?
Well, that's a good question. I mean,
Assets are in the name. And they would be separate.
yeah, because that's one of those things that separates those assets from the marriage, as if that's kind of like, again, it's like, if it's irrevocable, it's like you don't even own them. It's just completely out of your control and it's managed by a trustee. So that would basically remove that need, because again, it's an irrevocable trust. And you have to make sure there's a couple little things like having control over a certain percentage of the assets or being able to withdraw a certain amount. You want to make sure you don't cross any barriers of, because then it'll show, well, you effectively have control over these assets. So now that doesn't really apply. But if you follow all those rules and you're a good little boy about all those things, then yeah, that'll separate from the marriage very well. But a revocable trust, I'm not sure.
Revocable, if the assets are in the name of it, you're the owner of the trustee and everything. Although if the spouse paid into something that's in the trust, like in the home mortgage, then they could sue you to try to sell.
Yeah.
A bank account that's under not a trust name.
Yeah,
Property is under a trust bank.
right. That's usually separated, but anybody can argue anything. When you do an irrevocable trust, you're gifting the money to that trust irrevocably. You might be the beneficiary and you get the income, but the whole thing is to take you out of the control. And if it's $5 or $13 million, it does get subtracted from that lifetime thing. Some people thought, let's give away $6 million and we'd still have another 6 or 7 because we give away 13 million. But if that 13 million dropped back to 5, then you've already given it all, and everything you give away now is going to be taxed. That's fun. That's what you can't go in.
Yeah. So then the last type of account that we'll talk here is custodial or guardian accounts. So you might think of accounts for minors like a UTMA or a UGMA or something like that. Or even if you're talking about like some sort of special needs account in where you need to have a guardianship over those assets to protect them from the beneficiary and stuff like that and make sure that it can be managed. So that's, again, just an account for people, either minors, adults who are unable to manage their own investments due to age or mental or physical incapacity. A court-appointed fiduciary is required, and each state may have its own restrictions, such as allowable types of investments and use of funds. So some of them might restrict that you can only use like super commonly available mutual funds and ETFs and common things or other stuff like that. So again, that'll be your minor accounts or custodial accounts for people who don't have their full capacities.
So is a court-appointed fiduciary involved with the UTMA, GMA?
So I think that's where you just are, you have any insight on that?
Well, usually the parents can be the controlling person or the trustee. You could have a court if it's a huge, trustee or what was this called? Uniform gifts to minor or trust
What?
when you're doing.
Uniform gift to minor or uniform transfer to minor. That's what they'll do.
Regardless, if you have a huge account, you can hire a trustee, an outside trust, to manage it. You don't need to choose the
No.
intent of the child.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the
Yeah.
benefit of the child.
That's when it comes down to real estate. I think you also need cognizant of the state laws too. Like
Yes.
states have slight differences as to what you can, what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right, 18.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's where a lot of the stuff, especially the custodial things, will make a big difference is when you're talking about state laws. So always make sure that you're up on that. That's another one of those things where that continued education is really important. Or just knowing a really, really good attorney is also a great option.
The downside is when they turn 18 or 21, age of majority, then they have a right to have it. If you don't tell them, I've never heard of this, but they can sue you for withholding, right? So I always tell people, just invest in an index fund. And then when you think they're old enough to handle it, give the shares to them. Then they can sell it, pay the tax. You have control of it. And if all of a sudden you needed the money for your retirement, you didn't tell them about it, you could use the money for yourself and not renege on it if you had.
Yep.
What about like educational IRAs or what 529?
529 plans? Yeah.
Plans or plans or are they?
They're different because with the 529, the contributor or grantor, whatever the terminology is specifically for that, they still have full control because it's one of those things where the person who gets the money is just a beneficiary designation, and you could change that at any time. So with a 529 plan, if you want to just change the beneficiary, you could do that at basically any time. And I don't think there's really any restrictions on that at all.
Yeah, the cool thing is you have a lot of money there and you've got a kid that really wants to go to college, then tell them better
Yes. Same with the
Change the
educational
beneficiary to-
I believe so. Yeah. So we already talked about most of the stuff, but community property registrations enjoy that particular tax benefit of when one spouse passes, both the survivors and the decedent's tax bases are stepped up to the fair market value of the asset at the date of death. Neither joint tenants with rights of survivorship nor tenants by the entirety enjoy the same tax benefit. So that's something really nice about being in a community property state is you get this awesome account type. The only other type of property that enjoys this is inherited property because all inherited property always steps up in basis unless we're talking about like an IRA or something like that. That's a tax deferred account. So again, we'll talk about these types of trust that we already mentioned. Revocable trust, it skips probate. So if you have beneficiaries on that, it'll get to your beneficiaries. It won't go through probate, and it's really easy to modify. So if you have a normal sized estate, say under $5 million, revocable trusts are great because you still have full control. You can pull assets in and out. You can change the terms of it at any time. You can adjust anything. But it stays in your estate. So if you are over that exemption amount, if you've got $7 to $20 million, then that could be a little bit more of a concern. Now with an irrevocable trust, again, it skips that probate process, but it's also not in your estate because you effectively gave up control. You let it go to the trustee and the trust, and they will be in control of that. They're more difficult to modify, not impossible. Usually expensive though, because you're usually going to have to pay an attorney a big fee if they're not willing to just restate the trust, and that would be the more inexpensive, easier way would be to restate the trust. But if they need to actually recreate the trust and change a lot of different terms, they're going to want a big fee for that. So that will just be if you're a beneficiary on that trust, you won't necessarily like inherit the whole asset, but all the assets within it will follow the instructions of the trust. So let's just say, just simply, if you set up an irrevocable trust, you put your brokerage account in it and you say, when I die, pass the assets to this kid, it just gets transferred like a normal transfer on death. But you can say something more specific like give them the income benefit until they die and then pass the remainder to this other person. Then that could be that they just get income payments until the term or their life has ended, and then it transfers to something else.
Not becomes revocable. They can change that.
Well, if the instructions are to give them the assets, then they can do whatever they want with those assets. But if the instructions aren't to simply release the assets to them, it stays within the control of the trust or the trustee, and it follows the directions that have been stated when you created it.
As an irrevocable one while you're alive. And when you die, it says convert it to an irrevocable.
That's what a revocable trust does, but you can start with an irrevocable trust.
Irrevocable, but then you gifted the assets.
Right. So an irrevocable doesn't always start as a revocable, though. You can't just create an irrevocable. So yeah, I just want to clarify.
It's a big step to do irrevocable.
Yeah.
No longer, you have to follow what you originally said.
Correct. Yeah. No, RMD's got to come out either way. Yeah, that was that was a conversation that we had. I believe that was last time that we did the class. We were really trying to figure that out because people were trying to use trust to kind of mimic a stretch IRA because those rules went away. And now if you pass an IRA on, they can't stretch it to their own lifetime. It's now all these other rules. And we were trying to figure out if you could do that by using a charitable trust, but it didn't really mathematically pan out too well because what happens with the charitable trusts is you can have this situation where if you leave an IRA to a charitable remainder trust, it can pay out all of the distributions tax-free and then pay income for life to a beneficiary, but then some amount has to stay left over to transfer to the charity. So mathematically, they don't end up getting all the assets. But to your point, no, you can't avoid RMDs with a trust. It sucks.
Try to do a legacy IRA trust. That's what I know. And then it says that the legacy IRA trust inherits my pension for my investment. And then it pays it out over the beneficiary's life. But now it's over 10 years. But the big benefit is they're in control of it. So if you had somebody that had a drug problem or something, you still want a legacy IRA to get the money, pay the tax, and keep it out of the hands of the beneficiary if there's an issue. In his case, when he gets his PhD, then
Yeah, and just something to remember about those trusts, and if you're going to leave assets to a trust, there's kind of two things that can happen is if you have what's called a conduit trust that receives the IRA distribution and then sends them right out to beneficiaries, then there's no estate tax consequences. So if the trust receives an asset and then immediately, promptly distributes it out to whatever beneficiary, so let's say you got an IRA and you want to split it between 3 people, but you want it to go through a trust first, whatever the deal is, you can just transfer it right out and then it'll go to all those people, no estate taxes. If the assets pause in the trust, now they're taxable at the trust level. So that's when you're going to have those really high income rates for the trust. So if the assets leave from whatever account it is, hit the trust, and they stay there for a little bit, it's going to be taxable at the trust level before it gets distributed via whatever instructions. So that's just something to kind of pay attention to. And it's not, paying the taxes is not the worst thing in the world, but obviously it's a reduction of the assets. So you want to see how that plays into your plan.
distributions get paid out to the trust, stay there, the trust pays the taxes. But if you transfer the distributions either into a beneficiary IRA or pay the cash to the beneficiary, they pay the tax. Is that right?
From the trust to a beneficiary IRA, I don't think that. You can go from the IRA to a beneficiary IRA directly, and that's fine, but you wouldn't need a trust for that.
So I think I've seen you guys that if the trust inherited the IRA, but the trust had words saying, no, don't give it to us and set up the beneficiary.
Yeah, that's what I was just describing as a conduit trust, is where it just passes through.
And so
Yeah.
you want to have that in your trust to make sure that maybe the trust is the beneficiary, but you have other words that say transfer it out immediately.
Well, it'll just say to distribute those, distribute it directly out. Yes.
Just to clarify, my kids are, let's say, 12. But I don't want them to have all my assets as soon as I die. I want them to wait till they're like 35. before they get all. So then that money now sits in a trust. And then the trust has to pay taxes. on
Yes.
that Versus me just dumping it all on kids, letting them pay. the taxes.
Correct.
Then being taxed twice, basically. Trying to avoid taxes,
One or the other.
okay, so when the trust gives it to the kids don't have to pay taxes.
If the trust pays the tax. So if you have an IRA and the trust receives it, pulls it out, pays the tax at a 40% rate. Then it grows and the trust pays taxes on the dividend. But when it pays it to the kids, they don't pay it a second time. But
Yeah.
it's better to have the kids as the beneficiary. Then when you die, they have a beneficiary IRA and their parent manages it until they're. But if you're worried that they get control of it, then you can see the attorney and set up a legacy IRA.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, it's just that pause in time. If the distributions come out and they don't immediately go to whatever beneficiary, that's where it's going to get taxed. So if it just comes in and then leaves, no taxes, they pay the taxes. If it comes in, stays, gets taxed, then once it gets paid out, then there's no additional tax on that.
You're talking about like from 1 year to another, like what's the time parameter for it to be conduit and going in and leaving versus?
That's a great question that I know Amy would have the answer for.
On that, because the trust was the beneficiary in this IRA. How can you be setting up these accounts? If it has mortgage to set it over and set up the beneficiary IRAs, that's not a problem. But if you don't do it on whatever the trust says, if the trust holds the IRAs for very long, I don't know what the time frame is.
Yeah,
I guess 6 months.
yeah,
They
probably.
you could run into if you don't get it set up. And because she's always saying, we gotta get this done. If we
Yeah.
don't get this done and they don't respond and sign the forms, the trust is gonna end up with all this IRA money and it's gonna pay it. So whatever it is, it's not a long time.
Yeah. So a couple trust related terms just to make sure that there's clarity. Grantor is the person who creates and funds the trust. So that'd be you if you're making that trust. Beneficiary is going to be the person who receives benefits, whether that's an income benefit, a use benefit, or just the assets period. So there's a lot of different ways that you can structure trusts. If you have real estate, for example, one thing that is like a qualified terminable interest trust or a Q-tip trust, you can place your residence into there. Then that way, if you pass, your spouse can continually use the asset and they can have that terminable interest, which is their lifetime interest, use the real estate, but it's in control by the trust, and they can use that real estate until they pass. Then it can get moved over to whatever beneficiary you want. So there's a lot of different ways that you can structure things by giving income benefits, straight up distributions, use benefits, a lot of different stuff beneficiaries can get, and then you can leave those to another beneficiary afterwards.
One client owned 10 acres of woodland, had a nice house, he sold it, had a life estate, but that kind of trust. And so the owner would live in his house for the rest of their life, but then they were more.
And then we've got the trustee, which will just be the person or company that manages the trust in accordance with the trust's terms. That's something that can be pretty useful, is like you can have a family member be a trustee of your trust, but if you've got a particularly dynamic and passionate family, that can introduce some interesting problems. And, you know, people are people. They can be convinced of things, they can be swayed to different. A lot can happen emotionally, especially after your passing. So if you want to make sure that this person is either arm's length enough from you so that they can handle the emotional depth of everything that's going to be happening and follow the terms properly, or you can hire a professional trustee to follow the terms for you. So oftentimes some companies that can create your trust, they might have somebody or they can be that person to make sure that all of the terms get followed to the letter and there's no problems and nobody can convince them otherwise, because they're not part of your family. They're not going to be part of this argument. They're just going to follow what you said to do and pay out everything as determined by the trust.
If you don't go with the company that made your trust, where else would you find like the fiduciary?
That would just, I'm not sure like what the exact.
We had that recently, client with a massive, but he has no family. So we researched a bunch of private trustees that want somebody local that could watch his house, and people order it also, and getting them to the doctor. So generally, it's better to have a big organization because they have deep pockets, and somebody that made a mistake or stole some money. But if it's on a local basis, you can look up. There's a trustee organization. If anybody had a question, Lisa has that information. But you can look them up, look up their background, look at their ratings, look at their licenses. And the other thing you want to do is if you hire a trustee, family member or somebody else, you want to get a bond, have insurance in case they make a mistake before they turn out to this on. Money does strange things. So private trustee, you can look up them and you'll find several, and then you can look at their background and their licenses. And if you use them, they will charge by the hour. Some of them charge a fee based on the assets. That kind of makes me uncomfortable because they might not be doing a lot of work for that. So they're charging an hourly rate, and they could be $100 to $150 an hour. I'm encouraging young people to go into that field because there's good work out there. So you look up individually, and if you have a hard time finding it.
Do I have a list?
Lisa in our office does, and she would be able to send you wherever she has it. But there's an organization like California Association of Private Fiduciaries, let's say, I'm making that up, but something like that. And you can get a list of all the people that are licensed by the state, and then you do your own research and look at their background, make sure there's no. Because one of them did that. You can talk to your insurance agent, or they can reference a bonding company that sells a bond on, completion bond for construction, bonds on somebody that has a fiduciary responsibility. You want to be able to ensure that if they run off of money, that's. I'm sure some people know that. That's a good guess. Sounds good. But the bond on a fiduciary fund. The main thing is you want to ensure the transaction and the end result. So if somebody disappears, then you've got an insurance company, and they're going to do a background on that person because they're not going to insure somebody at risk that may disappear. That's why the big institutions are better, but they're very expensive. And if you get somebody local that's highly licensed and respected, it would be better. as far as what you get with buying.
So there's some special types of trusts that we can get into. We'll just go through these charitable trusts really quickly. You've got two main types of charitable trust, a charitable lead trust and a charitable remainder trust. Once you kind of understand the types, the words make a lot of sense. Charitable lead trust basically says that there's a specific set of assets directed to a chosen charity for a set period of time. So we're just kind of saying that these assets are going to go for sure. But a remainder, charitable remainder trust basically says that some person is going to receive income from the assets until they die. Then all the assets are going to go to charity. So whatever ends up left over after those distributions, those income distributions or whatever, whatever's left over, the remainder gets transferred to that charity. So you get a big deduction for both of these types of accounts. So it's basically just a giant charitable deduction. Yes. Yes. Yes, you can. Then the remainder of the account goes there. Exactly. So if you are not super worried for a beneficiary to get the IRA account, you can take the income, or you can make the charitable remainder trust the beneficiary of your IRA, so that when you pass, that amount goes there, and then you can have that income paid to your child or whoever else that you would have made the beneficiary, then let the assets go to the trust. So if you just wanted to give them a little bit of income for the rest of their life or whatever the decision was, and then the rest of the assets go to charity, that's one way that you can provide for both of the charitable desire and your kids at the same time.
They will pay tax.
Yes, because it's still an IRA distribution. Yeah, it's still an IRA distribution either way, because you're not getting rid of those. But you're just not going to deal with the lump sum that's left over after any of those distributions.
If I have RMDs, I can give them to a charity,
Yes,
can I?
yes, you can.
Avoid me being taxed. I can't give my RMD to a person.
No.
A charity qualify.
Yeah, you can gift any amount of money you want from an IRA straight to a charity, and that can be your RMD, and that's called a QCD, or a qualified charitable distribution. So if you don't want your RMD, you can give it up and give it straight to a charity. If there's some people that just like, they know exactly what their income is, and they don't need any more, they don't want any more, they know that their account will maintain value, and then they'll leave it to whoever they want to. And if they just don't want the income, you can just decide to just forward it straight to a charity and not worry about it.
It's time for saving money into your IRA and saving, and then at the end, when you have to draw it out, you can't draw it out, you have to give it away.
You just have to pay taxes.
You just have
Yeah.
to- Yeah.
Yeah.
But you still pay taxes on it.
Yeah.
Why do people want to give it to a charity if they're, because you're still gonna.
Yeah.
They didn't need it.
Yeah, it's just like a lot of people who either don't need it, or they decide that they've created something else that's providing for them, and they want to use these assets for charitable distributions. Some people they have a big want to be charitable, and these IRAs are going to be your least tax efficient asset in your retirement. So if you've got a big trust, or you've got some other more tax efficient vehicle that you could pull from for your own expenses, and you realize, I don't really need the money that's in my IRA, or I don't need the income distributions, then I can forward those and fulfill my charitable desires. And if you're just giving your RMDs, you're still maintaining your account value, and then you can leave that to a beneficiary or whatever you want to do afterwards. But you can just kind of avoid the RMDs if you don't really feel like taking the income. But right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not a real delay because you get the money, but it's almost like delaying the payment to you. If you're earning 7%, you're paying out 4 to charity. It's growing by 3, and the beneficiary, it rolls over to them, and they start taking the distribution. So that's a frustrating part about being saving and being successful, is it doesn't feel like it, because everything you pay out, if you think you own everything, you got news for it. But at least it's better than not owning it.
You said Roth conversions are for your beneficiaries, but it seems to be like having up and up.
Yeah.
But I should be doing some.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not gonna be in trouble.
Yeah. Well, and the other good thing is you reduce the size of your taxable retirement plan, that's gonna have smaller distributions than if you don't do that. So, that's the big thing that we tend to forget is if my IRA is really big and I do the conversions, it's gonna be smaller when I have to pull out. So therefore my RMD needs to be smaller. And so, yes, absolutely.
Another special type of trust that we don't see super often, but you can use is a generation skipping trust. So in the same way that there's a general estate tax, there's also a generation skipping tax. There's the same exemption as the estate tax, the same 13 point whatever million dollars, but you have another tax that can come into play if you're skipping generations and basically giving to a grandchild or some other arbitrary age rules that there are out there. But if you have assets that go to a trust upon death, and then that income is paid to your children, but the assets don't go to them, and then the assets go to the grandchildren, that's considered generation skipping, because you're skipping over the kids, and you're going straight to the grandkids. But again, we don't see that super often. Well, while it's in there, the trust is going to pay the taxes, because it's, the income will get passed through. That won't get taxed at the trust rate if it's just dividends come in and then go straight out to the children. Those won't get taxed. So if you're just holding assets and you're not trading or selling, then there won't be any tax consequences. But it all kind of depends on what assets get in there, how they get in there. For the most part, when we're talking about this trust tax, the reason that we're most concerned about it is when it comes from a place that you were going to have to pay taxes on anyway, like an IRA. If you're just putting in assets and there's no tax consequence for putting them in there, the trust tax is not going to be a concern until they're sold. So if there's capital gains, then sure. Or if there's income that stays in the trust, sure, that'll get taxed at the trust rate. But if I just put a bunch of securities in the trust, no sales happen, the income that comes to the trust immediately gets shot out to the beneficiary, there's not going to be a trust tax consequence until there's some event that generates tax.
So I would imagine you do this whole thing with this out with your kids.
Yeah, basically.
Secondly, does this extend that 10-year limit? Because now it's.
No, because that doesn't matter. Because the only thing that matters for that 10-year, like that rule doesn't look beyond the first beneficiary, and the first beneficiary is the trust. So if you leave your IRA to a trust, that's the beneficiary. It does not care that the kids are getting the money. That doesn't matter, because the trust inherits it, and then the trust has to distribute it over that period of time.
And if it doesn't, the trust has to pay tax after a year. It's like a 1 year. If you leave your IRA in your trust, and you don't do the conduit transfer out, and it stays there, it's going to pay the taxes. It can only
Right.
And get taxed for.
Yeah.
It has to pay it out within a year, where human beings have to. And the generation skipping trust is actually done. If your kids are doctors or, they make too much money, you don't want them to get all this stuff. They don't need it. We're going to take care of the next generation. And it was a way to try to get away from paying taxes. And this is the government saying, no, you're not.
This is a good excuse to tell them that they got to move back.
Well, or if your house is paid off, you tell them, look, you're not visiting much. I'm gonna have to get a reverse mortgage and hire people to come out and visit. They go, no, don't get debt on your house. I'm gonna inherit it.
So it's actually 5 years, not 1 year.
Oh, 5 years?
Yeah, it's 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, well, 5 years is how long the trust has to distribute it,
Oh,
not how long it can be in there. I think we got mixed up on the conversation a little bit there, because the conduit's a totally different discussion. We're talking about if the trust inherits the IRA, and then it's not going to be a conduit trust. How long does the trust have to distribute that? Because the IRA changes registration. It's like a beneficiary IRA. So if I get your beneficiary IRA, I have 10 years to distribute it.
right.
If a trust gets your beneficiary IRA, it has 5.
Okay.
So that's kind of the difference there.
You have to have grandchildren. You can say potential grandchildren,
Right.
do not make sure your kids can get grandchildren.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we've also got stuff like grantor retained annuity trust, which is basically you put your assets in the trust and they're used to pay an annuity payment back to the grantor until the specified term ends, which could be lifetime or it could be periods certain like 10 years, 15 years. Then the remaining assets will transfer to the beneficiaries named. We've also got an irrevocable life insurance trust. So if we're concerned about a really, really big estate, we're past that exemption and we know there's a portion of our assets that we're going to need to pay estate taxes on, you can create an irrevocable life insurance trust where you gift money to the life insurance trust. It purchases life insurance on you, and then it gets the proceeds and decides to pay your estate tax bill. And now, because this is all outside of your estate, those proceeds don't end up contributing to your overall estate, and they can just be used to directly pay the tax.
Making a gift to a trust, and the beneficiaries have to have a right to take that gift or cash, and spend it. They don't have to buy the life insurance. If you mandate that they buy life insurance with your gifts to the trust, then it brings it all back into your estate. So you set up an irrevocable trust, and you buy life insurance, but you donate the premiums to the trust, and have it open to be rated. If the kids don't rate it, they buy the life insurance, and the trust owns the life insurance. Then when you die, the trust gets the life insurance tax-free. And then they can pay your taxes or not. But if you control it too much, the death benefit, because the problem is, if you win the lottery, you've got 13 million, you've got another 10 million of death benefit. Now your estate's worth 23 million and have more taxes. So you set up a trust that if you donate the premiums to buy the life insurance, that's gonna be received tax-free to pay off the estate tax. But if you don't watch what you're doing, you're just bringing more death benefit money to the estate and higher tax.
Yeah. So then we've also got a special needs trust. So if you've got somebody who has special needs and they qualify for certain government benefits and receiving assets would disqualify them, that's the point where you use a special needs trust, which basically just assists a special needs dependent without compromising those government disability benefits like I mentioned. But it has to just pay for medical care or day-to-day needs. Now, day-to-day needs is kind of variable, so it kind of depends on what the situation is, and those are pretty generous, but
Does that trust cover gambling addictions?
the other thing that we've got, which is basically, this is the more, if you want to get really particular about how you're giving assets, or you really don't like something your kids are doing and only want to give them money if they stop doing it, spendthrift trusts are great. It maintains full ownership of the assets upon the grantor's passing, so it holds those assets in that trust. And there's a special clause that dictates exactly how, like it just exactly, you can be as particular, you can require college education, you can basically say whatever you want. This is where you really get to decide all of those different factors and can be pretty much anything that you determine. You can make them wait until they get married and then distribute assets. You can get really, really particular with this. So whatever portion of assets that they're going to receive, you can say this much college education, do this thing, be this age, get married, whatever, have kids, doesn't matter. Whatever it is that you want to say, you can be very, very particular with this.
All spendthrift trust, or you have terminal word first in your regular bill?
That's basically what it is. It's like a spendthrift provision, which just says that these assets have to be distributed that way. Am I correct in that?
It says, when I die, go set up a separate trust. And there's an interesting little thing about a will. There is what I call a trust will. You can set up a will if you didn't have these documents. And say, if I die, then you have permission to go set up a trust and take all my life insurance proceeds and hold it for the kids.
You mean a testamentary trust?
Oh.
My lawyer said that I had to have separate will and separate trust. So that the will lists the assets and the trust tells how to distribute all the assets.
It depends on what assets we're talking about. So assets that have a beneficiary designation, you just designate the trust. But if you have an asset like a really nice desk, you want to use a will, right? So it, like, if you can't just say with the asset that it goes to the trust, or this is where it's going, that's when you want to use that will. So if you have like a transfer on death provision or something like that, you just name the trust. And it's going to go there via what's called contract law. And that's your most solid, that's the way to transfer things over. And that's what you want to use. But yeah, if you have assets that can't be included like that, that don't have beneficiary designations, then yeah, you'll want to use a will in order to move those to the trust. Yeah.
Make sure you title whatever assets are supposed to be in the trust and the trust. I've had people come in that should know better, and they never got around to putting the trust on the title of the house. So when we do a review each year, how's the house held? Is it in the trust? Is it? It's easy to miss those things.
But can you put, Lamborghini was under trust?
Probably, on the registration, I'm gonna guess that you put the state of population, this is under a trust. I'm guessing, I'll leave that up to you.
I've heard it called a pour-over will in, it's a
Right.
provision. that
Yeah.
is What captures all the.
Yeah, exactly. Where it just kind of like catches all those other things that you might have not thought to individually inventory, stuff like that. Absolutely. So a testamentary trust, just like he was talking about, also called a will trust. Basically, the trust is established upon death as specified in the will. So it does avoid probate, but it's still included in the estate. So it's basically like a revocable trust that you don't set up till you die, then it's never revocable and it turns into an irrevocable. It's just like, it's an irrevocable trust that didn't exist before your death, so it's still included in your estate. So it's just like if you didn't have a need for a trust, but you wanted to set it up after you die, this is what you'd use. So we got a little bit of an estate planning checklist that you'll want to follow. Just this right here is really just kind of all the basic things that you want to make sure you do is make sure you create an inventory of your assets so you know what you're distributing, you know what you're giving to your kids and to your other beneficiaries. Account for all your family's needs. Make sure that you know who needs to get income, who needs to get assets, all these different things. Establish your directives, whatever you want to happen, either after your death when it comes to funeral costs or all sorts of things, or even things in the interim if you're disabled before death. Make sure stuff like advanced medical directives and wills and all sorts of things are established beforehand. Review your beneficiaries. Always make sure that it's your favorite kids and not the one you don't like that's getting all your assets. Note all your state's estate tax laws to make sure if your state has anything in particular that's happening. I don't know if California really has anything to be concerned about in terms of estate laws. We don't have estate taxes or anything. Yeah. And then just weigh the value of professional help. Like if you've got more complicated stuff that you want to get done that you can't just designate a beneficiary on an insurance policy to do, even if it's just for a little short consultation to make sure that what you have done is correct, it's always good to just get an opinion. That's a lot of the things where even if you're doing everything that we talk about yourself, just getting an hour of somebody's time every once in a while, bringing your little plan that you're doing and saying, does this all work? Am I following all the laws? Am I doing this properly? Am I exposed to any risks? Always a good idea. And then just plan to reassess. That maintenance, just make sure you're doing it regularly and keeping up with everything. Yes.
State tax laws are for you, the person, when you die, it's that state.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah, it'll be the state that you die in. Yeah. So yes.
Wisconsin, but my official residence is Texas, I'm considering moving to California. And all my state work right now is in Wisconsin.
Right.
And like, how long is that gonna last me before I can redo it?
That's a good question. You know?
I would get a consultation because California probably has some ruling that says you either have so much time or respect the out of state trust and will, but that's my guess. And
I can look that up.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would look it up, yeah. And you could always talk to a paralegal or an attorney. Paralegals a little safer because they're gonna help you. They're the ones that end up doing all the work anyway. But yeah, check that out and then but they have some type of reciprocal work, but I can't say that I know.
So like if you own two homes, like one in different states, but you have to declare one as your primary, like it's like.
Right.
Okay,
Mhm.
that would be the state. They'd have it.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
I think the home state will respect that if you have your trust and everything. If you have something inside, but the good thing is that state that you own that property in, like Oregon or Washington or whichever, if they have a state tax, that could get snagged for an asset that if it goes over this, and then some of them will have state taxes over $100,000 or $1 million. And so if you have a rental that's worth more than what their minimum is, the state itself could trigger an estate tax on that property.
Yeah. So that actually brings us to our time for today. We've got some extra slides that we'll start the next class with the next time, but I hope this was helpful and you'll learn something again. So thanks for